Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to a new episode of the Jewish People Policy Institute's Inside Analysis of the State of Affairs in Israel and the Jewish world. On today's episode, we're going to travel, at least on this Zoom and podcast, to northern Israel. While the world's attention is naturally focused on the Gaza Strip, there's a mini war raging in the north, with daily strikes on both sides of the Israeli-Lebanese border, as we saw today with the strike against a senior Hezbollah commander driving in a car in southern Lebanon. Will this unravel and escalate into a larger conflict, or can it de-escalate and once again become contained? These are some of the questions we'll try to answer today. And to help us understand what's happening, I have three people who will be joining us. The first is Sarit Zehavi, a former intelligence officer and IDF lieutenant colonel in the reserves. Sarit is the founder and president of Alma, which is a nonprofit and independent research and education center which specializes in Israel's security challenges on the northern border. I actually first met Sarit a few years ago when she spoke at an APAC conference in Washington, D.C., and was very impressed with her knowledge and expertise. And after my conversation with Sarit, I will have the opportunity, we'll have a panel with two of our JPPI fellows. We'll be joined by Einat Wilf, a former fellow, to be more accurate, with JPPI, and a former member of Knesset and author of a number of books, as well as with Professor Gil Troy, who's here with us, who is an American historian and a Zionist thinker. Also, the writer and author of many, many books. Before we get to Einat and to Gil, here is the interview I did with Sarit Zehavi.
Okay, check it.
Sarit, it's great to have you back on the JPPI webinar and podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Welcome, my pleasure.
So there's so much going on as we think about the North. We're just after a Shabbat during which, 60 rockets or so were fired at the Meron Mountain at an IDF observation post nearby. And the tension just seems to be through the roof, I would call it. So I wanted to check in with you and get your sense of what's happening, what's Nasrallah thinking, where are things headed? Give us your insight, please.
Yeah, it was a busy Shabbat. Even from a personal point of view, I can say that I could hardly sleep because during the night before, between Friday to Saturday, we heard the fightings all the time. And then on Saturday morning, we had alerts and we had to run for shelter. There were alerts almost all over the Galilee. I don't know exactly why, and we don't have all the information of how many rockets were launched, where to exactly they were launched, but the bottom line is that to talk about routine in this kind of situation is kind of awkward. Eventually, tens of thousands of people ran for shelter on Saturday morning, 8 a.m. The reason that there was an attack of a few tens of rockets on Saturday morning was, as Nasrallah said, this is the initial retaliation of Hezbollah to the assassination of number 2 in Hamas, El-Aruri. El-Aruri was assassinated in the heart of the suburb of Hezbollah in Beirut.
The Dahia.
Dahia, in the main street. This is where he lived. This is where he worked. So that's why this is where he was killed. But I think this is why Nasrallah had to be involved in the retaliation. And to tell you the truth, I was not 100% positive that Hezbollah will be directly involved in the retaliation. But it is what it is. There was a claim of responsibility of Hezbollah to this attack, saying that it's the initial attack, meaning that there will be more. By itself, I'm not sure about the damage. We don't know exactly. Against IDF is not publishing that. But definitely, we can say that a new reality was created on the Israeli-Lebanese border, and this is kind of a stable reality in the past at least 2 months and maybe even more, of 8, 10, 15, 5 attacks coming from Lebanon every day. Mainly anti-tank missiles, which are accurate missiles. You can see them just behind me over there.
That looks like a Cornet missile on the screen. Yeah.
It is a Kornet missile, and what you actually see is a miss of this Kornet missile of the vehicle that from which this photo was taken. It was not a photo, of course, it was a video, a regular camera in a vehicle. And then when you freeze the image, you understand how close it was, and that people were very lucky inside this vehicle. In a way, we are being hunted by these missiles of Hezbollah, and they cannot be intercepted. These are missiles that are anti-tanks, meaning the tanks has defensive systems against these missiles, but
like
people,
the trophy.
Yeah, people, regular vehicles, homes, apartments, whatever, they don't have any defense against these missiles, and that's why it's a problem, and we see this happening every day.
But what do you think? I mean, so that was what we saw on Saturday. It seemed like Hezbollah venting and responding to the Al-Aruri killing in Beirut. But beyond that, we've had for the last 90 days this kind of unwritten rules of engagement of where within a 4 or 5 kilometer radius of the border, they attack us, we attack them. No one goes further into Israel or into Lebanon. And if we do, and if it was Israel that was behind the Beirut killing of Al-Aruri, Israel's not saying it was, so it keeps that quiet. But everyone assumes it was Israel, obviously. But what does Hezbollah want here? Because we know that the Americans and Amos Hochstein, the envoy, has been to Beirut. He's trying to reach some deal about the disputes along the border on the blue line, right? The international border. Where should the line really be? And we know that they think they can push the Hezbollah forces north of the Litani River. In Israel, there's more skepticism. What are your thoughts if this is even possible? Is there a diplomatic resolution here that can be achieved?
So you're asking 2 questions. First, you're asking what Hezbollah wants, and second, you're asking my opinion about these diplomatic negotiations that are going on. As for the first question, the answer lies not only in Beirut, but also in Tehran. Because the idea of what is now happening is to create a multi-front campaign against the state of Israel and against the West, by the way, in general, any Western presence in the Middle East. And that's why you see the Houthis active in the Red Sea and in the Arab Gulf, and you see the militias in Syria and in Iraq attacking American forces, and you see the situation that was created on the northern border as well. All of this is coordinated. It's not about a chain of command. All these militias have their own interests, local interests, but they are all also proxies of Iran, and they receive these capabilities, and they share the same ideology. And the Yemenis are a very good example. Just on Friday, we had the demonstration of millions that responded to the ask of their leaders to go out to the street and support the campaign in the Red Sea. And they were all carrying the logo, or if you like, the signs of the Houthis of Yemen, which it's actually a few sentences. It's not a shape or a painting. And one sentence says death to America, the other one says death to Israel, and the third one says a curse upon the Jews. So you understand what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
For Hezbollah, the situation that was created here is the most comfortable situation, because it put Israel in an unbearable situation. The 60,000 people cannot go back to their homes. It has already got the achievement with very little damage. And yes, 150 Hezbollah casualties since the war started. That's very little damage to Hezbollah, okay? Out of tens of thousands of warriors, the Hezbollah can absorb, can contain this kind of damage, and Hezbollah is willing to continue to do what it has done until today. And the proof is that, the choice and the decision to retaliate for Al-Aruri's killing, even though Al-Aruri is from Hamas, because Hezbollah is not deterred. And deterrence with regard to Hezbollah is all about neutralizing capabilities rather than intentions. Because as I've said, for Hezbollah, this is the most comfortable situation. Mm-hmm. Very small price to pay. Lebanon was not destroyed. Tehran, of course not. Nasrallah himself is not at risk. What's the problem? Now, I will say even one step further. Even if it will escalate to war, and it's probably an option on the table, to war in a full scale, because it's already war in a low scale. Hezbollah, this is what it wanted. Before,
It wants what? Just Israel locked down and focused on the border
it
without.
wants to take over Lebanon. And if the price is the destruction of Lebanon, let it be. As simple as that. And if Hezbollah is looking backwards to 2006, when there was a lot of destruction to Lebanon as well, and looking at the process that Hezbollah has gone through since 2006, in 17 years, it became stronger, not weaker.
Mm-hmm. So another war, while we think might bring destruction to Lebanon from their perspective, assuming Nasrallah can survive that war, personally survive, he thinks he'll emerge stronger. Is that what you're saying?
That's why I'm saying the only deterrence is elimination of capabilities, okay? In a way that will enable us to live for a few years in quiet. I'm not even talking about solutions. Now,
so basically, your answer to the diplomatic solution is we shouldn't fool ourselves. Maybe this can give us some quiet, but this is not a full.
No,
right.
My answer to the diplomatic solution is a question: can this diplomatic solution eliminate capabilities of Hezbollah? I'm not even talking of all the capabilities of Hezbollah. Can it eliminate capabilities of Hezbollah? That's the main question that should be asked today. And I am doubtful in this because we had a diplomatic solution 17 years ago that cost a lot of money. 10,000 UN soldiers are already deployed in South Lebanon.
But they're ineffective.
Okay, so what kind of international force will be effective, and what's the meaning of effectiveness? Because Hezbollah is entrenched into the southern Lebanese population. It's not a foreign militia that took over South Lebanon. The military
they come from there, correct? Yeah,
they live there.
Yeah.
Okay, so if they live there and their families are there and their homes are there, how exactly are we going to push them out of there?
So wait, Sarit, so let me understand you for a moment. And I just want to push on this point. I mean, personally, I'm skeptical also that there's any solution, and I don't want a war, but I don't understand how we can continue to live with a sword up against our neck in the north after we've dealt with Hamas in the south. It's not what I explain to people all the time. It's not normal for a country, for people like you and your kids and your family and other families to live in range of over 100,000 rockets. This makes no sense that are pointed at us to kill us. This doesn't make sense.
It's 200,000 rockets, and they're threatening all the state of Israel.
No, I understand. Okay, but you're further north than I am in Jerusalem, so you're more at the front than I am. But this isn't normal, and we have to the world needs to realize this isn't normal. But so because it's not normal, and because there isn't going to be a diplomatic solution, is it that war is inevitable?
Again, there is already war. So the question is, what the scale of the war? There is already war. This is the framing that we need to change. We are living under fire every day.
Yeah.
It's the same, by the way, in the Lebanese side. Okay, people were voluntarily evacuated in the Lebanese side because IDF is responding and killing the squads that are launching these anti-tanks. And this is before discussing Radwan brigades that are capable of invasion into Israel and creating the same massacre as Hamas had done. That's the main fear of the people that are living here. Okay, so I think that eventually, there is a gap between what I would want to happen and what actually will happen. And I believe, I don't want war either, and I understand that war has a huge price. But the alternative of creating a diplomatic arrangement that will be ineffective also has a huge price, because it would mean that we will experience another massacre.
I want to, in just the few minutes that we have left, I want to shift gears for a moment. A report that you came out with at Alma a couple years ago in the summer of 2021 has resurfaced now. That was about tunnels that Hezbollah had created. We were all familiar with in 2018 when Israel launched that operation, Northern Shield, I think they called it, to take out the almost a dozen or so Hezbollah tunnels that were found along the border. But now the reason your report has resurfaced is because there were comments that were made by the head of Northern Command, General Gordon, who spoke about how if there are tunnels, we're always keeping our ears open, our eyes open, and we will be in touch with the residents of the North and keep them updated. So people are now talking about Hezbollah tunnels as we're seeing hundreds of kilometers of tunnels in Gaza. in your report, I was looking at it, was very interesting from back in 2021. It spoke about how Hezbollah did this together with North Korea, obviously a lot of financing from Iran as well. But this is, do we know of tunnels? What's your, what do you think is happening there? And how serious is
Look,
Israel taking this threat?
I'm not with intelligence anymore, so I don't know what intelligence know. But to tell you the truth, even UNIFIL in its last report reported 3 openings in the ground. Okay, just giving you an example. There are different kinds of tunnels, as you've seen in Gaza as well. There are tunnels that are border crossing tunnels. These were blocked, as you mentioned. There are tunnels, or there may be tunnels that are ending next to the border but not crossing the border. Also, creating, if these exist, they create a great risk because, again, Radwan brigades can pop up of these tunnels on the Lebanese side of the border, but very close to it. There are strategic tunnels, which this is the report is all about, the strategic tunnels that are wide enough to contain launchers inside and trucks and to actually transfer military operatives and munition from one area to another in Lebanon. This is what the report is all about. All these tunnels are actually drilled the same way, basically, but there are different sizes of these tunnels. Underground warfare shouldn't be a surprise and shouldn't be news. Okay, this has been going on since, I don't know, World War II, at least maybe 3,000 years ago, if you look at the land of Israel. Okay, this is underground warfare. Everything that you saw in Gaza, piers everywhere, you're going to see in Lebanon. Everywhere.
And that should just be the assumption.
Everywhere, that everything that you saw in Gaza, rockets and mortars and munitions in every home, you're going to see in Lebanon, especially in the Shiite areas of South Lebanon. The terrain is different. It's more challenging. It is more challenging to excavate in Lebanon. That's correct. But right. Hezbollah had much more time because Hezbollah started, as you said, in the end of the 90s.
It's frightening to think about, but there was one movie that I watched a couple of times where you see Imad Mornia, the infamous leader, military commander of Hezbollah, who was killed in a CIA Mossad operation in 2008 in Damascus. And he's there in full military fatigues, showing people around a tunnel with this, literally like a pickup truck almost inside. And those are one of the, I think, the tunnels that Israel eventually discovered, but who knows, obviously, what else is out there. And what Hezbollah might have. And this is very concerning. I think, you know, as we think about the end of the war with Gaza, with Hamas in Gaza, we obviously have to be thinking about everything that's happening up north. So I want to thank you, Sarit, so much for joining us. And your work is so important for all our listeners and viewers. You got to follow Sarit and her staff at Alma, because what they do is, if you want to keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening in Israel and Lebanon, that's the place to do it. So thank you very much for joining.
Good to have you with us. Einat, unfortunately, is not able to join us at the last moment, so it will just be the two of us who will talk today. And I wanted to, follow up on the conversation with Sarit, which I think is very interesting. And we just think about what happened earlier today when there was that strike against that car in southern Lebanon. This Al Tawil character, some Hezbollah battalion commander level commander, was killed in this car. Photos have emerged now that he was apparently the driver at some point for Qasem Soleimani, the late Quds Force leader of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, whose job was it to basically build up and prop up Hezbollah to become the force that today it is and the way it threatens Israel. Why he was killed, why Israel decided, and Israel hasn't taken responsibility for it, but why at this very unique time, when Secretary Blinken is scheduled to land in Israel at any moment, and one of his objectives is to try to de-escalate and contain this war in Gaza, not to draw to a wider conflict, why Israel would now decide to do something like that remains to be answered. There's probably a couple of reasons. There might be some people who say now is actually the time to go to a war with Hezbollah. There are others who maybe it was a mistake. They didn't know he was in the car. Maybe they thought it was someone else, or he was on his way to actually an attack, and therefore
needed to be stopped because that attack needed to be stopped from happening. But I want to get from your perspective, Gil, what your feeling is about the potential of the second front that Israel's facing. You know, we have this war obviously with Hamas. Do we have, us Israelis, do we have it in our stomach right now to fight another war?
Before we get to our stomachs, let's get to our head and our vision. I think it's really important that the West, that the United States of America, and that American Jewry understand that there is no justification for Hezbollah doing what it's doing. And that there's a sort of built-in assumption in the world conversation that somehow it's okay for Israel just to be absorbing these rockets, that it's okay for there to be this UN resolution, which Sarit, you mentioned, from 2006, 1701, which is going to be the diplomatic solution, and for it to be not just ignored, but blatantly violated, that it's okay for Hezbollah to build up so many forces and put together so many armaments. And indeed, we've been talking about 150,000, and Sarit, who's been an important voice for years saying, beware, 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 points out it's 200,000. So I start with that because I think it's very important to frame this, always this kind of, what did Israel do to deserve this? What did Israel do wrong? And, you know, Daniel Patrick Moynihan always said, why are you asking what's wrong with the accused? Look at the accuser. Look at the aggressor. And let's be very clear that Hezbollah is the aggressor. Now, having said that, I think there are two parts to the Israeli stomach. I think on the one hand, after October 7th, there is no tolerance anymore for all these illusions and all these delusions, the illusions of the West and the delusions that we allow ourselves to buy into. We cannot afford to have tens of thousands come back to Kiryat Shmona, to Metula. And again, we point out that on October 7th, had Hezbollah attacked, it would have been a bloodbath 10 times the scale. So there's zero tolerance for this kind of insecurity anymore, and for the delusion that we're secure when we're not. On the other hand, we are well aware, I think one of the sobering things about the Gaza conflict has been an awareness of just how dependent we are on American munitions, on American goodwill. And there really is a fear that if we don't get the green light from America, how do we function and how do we defeat this enemy, which everyone knows is 10, 20, 30 times better trained, 10, 20, 30 times better armed, and on a certain level, almost 10, 20, 30 times more motivated than Hamas. And the one silver lining this whole thing is that the Israeli army, which for years I worried about as being an army that had been trained, but didn't really have any combat experience, after these awful 3 months has a tremendous amount of combat experience and has also shown that it has a toughness and a grit and a determination and a morale that would be a mistake for France, for Lebanon, for the United States of America, for the United Nations, and for Hezbollah to underestimate.
You know, Gil, you talk about American support for Israel, and I want to get to that in a moment. I also see we have an interesting question from Rabbi Reuven Taff about Iran. I want to get to that too, but I first want to stay one more moment focused on Hezbollah, because there was an interesting poll that came out just a few days ago in Ma'ariv, in an Israeli daily newspaper, which spoke about and showed that 66%, if I'm not mistaken, or 67% of Israelis are in favor of a preemptive strike against Iran. They believe that now, against Hezbollah, that now is the time for Israel to actually go to war against Hezbollah. And by the way, when I think about it myself, I don't want war. I never want war. But in following up and kind of connecting to what you just said, it doesn't make sense. It's absurd that we are expected to live this way. It's absurd that we here in Israel are expected to live with this threat on our border with 200,000 rockets pointed at us, and that's normal. No, that's not normal, and that shouldn't be that way. And we should be able to somehow eliminate and remove that threat from that border. Is there a political solution possible? I'm skeptical. I know the Americans are working hard on it. I don't see that happening. Does that mean we have to go to war? Not necessarily, but it could be that war is inevitable. And if you have such resounding support of 66% of Israelis, it could be that some politician might think now is actually the time to go do it. What do you think?
I think the 66% is a reflection of the fact that one of the many, many failures of the October 7th or pre-October 7th conceptia was that we could just defend ourselves, and that a defensive line and a defensive tack is enough. We're seeing that to actually be pro-peace means to occasionally be willing to use war. And there's this delusion, I'm sorry to say, in too much of the West, and especially in the American left and in major parts of the American Jewish community, I'm sorry to keep on harping on that, that somehow if you're pro-peace, it means that you never ever go to war. And we actually see that if you are pro a little bit of war, it's kind of like an inoculation, you can actually avoid the bigger conflict. And had we been a little more aggressive in containing Hamas, we wouldn't be in this awful situation we are now. Similarly, had we been a little more aggressive, had we been turning to the United Nations in 2007, 8, 9, 10, saying, wait a minute, this is unacceptable, and had more of a preemptive approach, we might have been better off. So I look at the 66% as saying enough. And I think also the 66% is a message to Hezbollah in particular, and I think that's what these assassinations are. And it's very funny. You know, it seems that in the Hezbollah calculus, that you can kill 22,000, and I don't necessarily buy their numbers, but in their world, you can kill 22,000 Gazans, that's okay. But God forbid you kill one of their favorite friends drinking coffee or driving a car. That's a casus belli, right? Let's be very, very clear that they don't appreciate human life. They look at all of us as pawns. And the time has come to strike both at the tentacles of the octopus, but I also agree that we have to also start talking more and more about the octopus. And I hope that every time Secretary of State Blinken comes here, I hope that every time every American official comes here, I hope that every time any American political leader travels in the American Jewish community, in the American pro-Israel community, in the American pro-defense community, they're asked three questions. What about Iran? What about Iran? And what about Iran?
I want to talk about the octopus, and I'm going to get there, but I do want to talk for a moment about U.S. support, which is something that you mentioned before. And I'm guessing that you and probably some of our listeners read and looked at the results of that new Gallup poll that came out over the weekend about U.S. support for Israel. There was also some interesting developments about, let's put it this way, that since 1997, when Gallup started to track U.S. Approval ratings in the U.S. for Prime Minister Netanyahu since he became prime minister back in 96, it's at an all-time low, which shouldn't necessarily surprise us. But what I found to be very interesting, Gil, is that when asked by Gallup if they believe that the U.S. is giving adequate support to Israel, 38, so again, is the U.S. giving enough support to Israel? 38% of respondents said that Israel gets the right amount of support. And then an additional 36 said Israel's getting too much support, while 24 said it isn't getting enough. So if you take the 24 and you add it to, I guess, the 38, you have a significant number of people who think we're getting the right amount of support and we're not even getting enough, getting more. So how do you square that up with what's happening in this kind of feeling that, you know, we're losing legitimacy, we're losing the international community? Doesn't seem like that according to the Gallup poll.
Look at three dimensions to this. Number one, I think we're actually seeing a remarkable resilience on the part of the American public that is often underestimated. We've seen, if you look at the Gallup polls for the last 20, 30 years, they've been consistently pro-Israel, 70 to 80%, no matter what happens in the media. And we have to stop being so driven by the Ivy League conversation and the media conversation about Israel that's not real. It's like the Twitter conversation, which elected President Elizabeth Warren or President Bernie Sanders. Oh no, it's President Joe Biden. We have to start understanding that there's a gap between the elite conversation and the media conversation and what's happening among, let's call it, mainstream real Americans. That's number one. Number two, the fact that so many Americans are able to say what so many Israelis are now able to say, which is, I have my criticisms of Benjamin Netanyahu, but Netanyahu, despite his long-term leadership in Israel, is not Israel. And so I can support Israel, even if I am critical of Netanyahu, shows, again, a deeper kind of resilience. But the most important message here is, I think, to the American Jewish community, to the Biden administration, and to the Democratic Party. The American Jewish community has to stop focusing on the very, very small percentage, both of Jews and non-Jews, who attack Israel all the time, and start emphasizing again and again and again, in their own conversations, in the conversations around the Shabbat tables, but also in their lobbying. And lobbying is legitimate because African Americans lobby, and Irish Americans lobby, and Italian Americans lobby, and American Jews are also able to lobby, that there is far more support for Israel than most people see. I think the Biden administration, as it enters into what every poll suggests is going to be a very, very difficult fight for any Democrat, let alone Joe Biden, to beat Donald Trump. And as Joe Biden said in his recent January 6th anniversary speech, this is an issue about the future of the American people and the American constitutional system, if you really feel that, then you have to start saying, hey, wait a minute, supporting Israel in the right way, in the most effective way, is a part of that broader defensive strategy of showing that the United States of America is strong, is functional, and that the Biden administration is not a weak, tepid administration led by an old man. And I'm not saying that to disrespect Joe Biden. I'm saying that to talk about the perception that's out there. And in fact, in the most crass political way, supporting Israel in an aggressive way, in an assertive way, in a principled way, and getting a win, both in the south over Gaza and in the north over Hamas, over Hezbollah, is a way of saying, hey, wait a minute, there's a vigor in this administration despite Joe Biden's advancing age. So I actually think we have been falling into the media trap, into the, I know it's X now, but I like to call it Twitter dumb trap, and into the Ivy League trap. And we ourselves have to pull ourselves out of it.
By the way, I mean, Joe Biden being obviously older, right, is not the one who necessarily has the health problems these days in the administration.
Correct.
After we saw the reports of Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, who apparently gets hospitalized in intensive care and doesn't bother to update anyone in the White House that he's out of commission for a few days, which is just a bizarre story in of itself. But I want to talk for the remaining few moments just about Iran. We have a question here by Rabbi Reuven Taff, who's with us, who's asking, why isn't there a discussion of a coordinated effort by Israel, the U.S., and other allies to cut off the head of the snake, which is Iran? Iran is the sponsor of all these terrorist groups. And Gil, you referred to Iran as the head of the octopus, but I mean, whatever metaphor you want to use, Israel today is fighting a war against the tentacles, against the proxies. We're fighting a war against Hamas. We're fighting a war against Hezbollah, that mini war in the north. We're getting hit by the Houthis. And my kids in the beginning were like, where do these guys come from? Right? Where did these people in Yemen, in Taiman, as we call it in Hebrew, what did they got against us? Like, we know the guys in Gaza, we know the guys in Lebanon, we know the Iranians. Now we got to worry about the Yemenites. So these are all Iranian proxies. We're seeing all this Iranian weapons. We're seeing all the Iranian support. And at the same time, no one is talking about Iran, and Iran is getting away literally with murder, chaos, and bloodshed that they are creating here in the Middle East. And the question really comes down to why. Now, I can give you reasons why I think Iran is doing this, right? Iran wants the world distracted. Iran wants the world and, of course, Israel to be focused on something else. They want to be able to run ahead with their nuclear program and not be bothered and have the world distracted. That's happening. We saw the IAEA report that came out recently, about 2 weeks ago now, that spoke about how they've increased and accumulated more highly enriched uranium at 60% levels than in the past. But why, Gil? And America, why is America giving them this free hall pass? Why are they being allowed to do all of this chaos, all of this bloodshed, and not pay even the tiniest of prices?
5 letters, JCPOA. I think in many ways, I've really been struggling with this question as a historian of why is it that the American political class is so weak on Iran, and particularly why is the American Democratic Party so weak on Iran? And I think in many ways it goes back to Barack Obama and Barack Obama's obsession with Iran, and from the time he was running against Hillary Clinton in the primaries, he made it a point of pride to say we can have negotiations with them, we can have an open dialogue with them. And throughout his administration, where he often was criticized in Washington for not doubling down on many issues and not going to the mat on many issues, when it came time to ultimately the JCPOA, the not treaty, they didn't call it a treaty because they knew they couldn't get it past the Senate, the agreement with Iran, that he pushed. And so it became a central part of Obama's identity. When we look at the foreign policy team that Joe Biden has assembled, it's very much a continuation of the Obama team. And I think it became so central to the Obama people and to the Democratic Party's foreign policy identity that to go back is very, very difficult. And I always say that, for people to make mistakes is natural in life and it's excusable. But to learn from your mistakes, that's inexcusable. And especially since October 7th, but even more for the past 2, 3, 4 years, as we saw Iran pushing the edge of the envelope in terms of its rush toward to go nuclear. The refusal of the democratic foreign policy establishment to acknowledge that Iran is at the source of these problems is unconscionable and inexcusable. Not only that, but if they learned their history, they would see that since the Iran-Iraq War, and we go back to the 1980s, the regime has understood that they cannot afford to lose Iranians in their foreign policy adventures, that the Iranian people will absorb all kinds of nonsense as long as Iranians are not killed. At the time, they lost over 1 million Iranians to the Iraqis in the Iran-Iraq War. And Iran has done a brilliant job of using all kinds of proxies. They're happy to sacrifice Hezbollah. They're happy to sacrifice Hamas. They're certainly happy to sacrifice Jews and Israelis. It's time for the United States of America to see that weakness and to start going back to the source. It's time also for us to stop playing video games and shooting down Houthi missiles in the air, but to start shooting at the source. You have to start going to the source of Iran, the source of the Houthis, where they're and start making them pay. And it shouldn't have to be Israel, but if it has to be Israel, then Israel will do it. Because at the end of the day, Iran has to start paying a real price, and the Houthis have to start paying a real price.
And I'll also
and that's
just
not
add
an aggressive pro-war position. That's a pro-peace position. Sorry.
No, I agree with you 100%. I'll just add in also that to people who are, anti-war, let's say, and think that you and I have become like the new neocons. It's Paul Wolfowitz here and Richard Pearl, right, who are on the call. You don't even have to fire a single missile or a single bullet. If you present the Iranians with a credible military threat by the Americans, you have the possibility to get the Iranians to recalculate. But unfortunately, since 2014 already, 2013, when the Obama administration started to engage in that JCPOA talk, which led to the deal, America has backed away from doing that. And that can work. And I don't understand for the life of me why they don't try. And I do kind of understand there's the red line. Biden doesn't want to make the mistake that Obama did with Syria. But where we're headed is in a bad direction, which is going to lead to a larger conflict. And this is a way to avoid it. And instead, we're burying our head in the sand. And that is something that is going to potentially haunt us for years to come.
I would like to add also, there also is a non-military approach, which it should start immediately, which is far more aggressive financial sanctions and far more aggressive attempts to turn off the oil spigot. And we've seen it before. That actually part of the reason what brought Iran to the table the first time around was the aggressive regime of sanctions. And I know that we have a problem because China would try to bypass, and there are other geopolitical dimensions. But the United States of America has to take a much more aggressive stance. And again, more aggression vis-a-vis Iran can actually lead to more peace. And we have to start rewiring the conversation and start seeing that less is more and more is less. And the more we look weak, the less of a chance we have of holding on to the peace. And the more we look strong, the less of a chance we have of losing things.
Yeah. Well, Gil, I want to thank you for joining us. I want to thank Sarit, who was with us earlier. And to all our listeners, thank you for being with another episode of the Jewish People Policy Institute's Inside Analysis. We will be back on Thursday for our next episode. In the meantime, let's hope for a bit of quiet around here. I think we all deserve it. Thank you.